Eliza Wells was barely a child when she came face to face with the forces of nature that would shape her life forever. It wasn't the typical childhood illness, the kind that children get and then recover from in a matter of days. No, this was something far more sinister, a sickness that seemed to drain the very life from her small frame. It started in the late spring of 1848, when the town of West Haven was already steeped in a thick, humid air that clung to the countryside like a damp cloth. The trees were heavy with leaves, their shadows long and stretching as the sun began its descent in the sky. For most of the townspeople, it was a time of quiet, languid afternoons. The farmers went about their work, the town market bustled in the mornings, and children ran barefoot in the streets, their laughter filling the air. Life in West Haven was simple, even idyllic, with only the occasional whisper of something unnatural, like a wild rumor carried by the wind, to interrupt the town's normal rhythm. But something darker was lurking beneath the surface, and it wasn't long before it found its way to Eliza. It began as a faint fever, one that seemed hardly worth noting at first. Eliza had been playing with the other children near the creek that afternoon, splashing in the cool water and chasing dragonflies, as children do. But when she returned home that evening, her face was flushed, and she was unusually quiet. Her mother, a stern woman of simple faith and few words, attributed it to the heat of the day and tucked her into bed with a glass of water, telling her to rest. But by morning, the fever had worsened. Eliza's mother was no stranger to illness. The Wells family, like many others in West Haven, had long endured the harsh realities of life in the mid-19th century, with diseases sweeping through the population like wildfire. Typhoid, cholera, influenza, all these were familiar enemies. But there was something different about Eliza's sickness. The fever raged, unrelenting and high, and her small body seemed to wither under its grip. By the time the local doctor arrived, a man named Dr. Gideon Holt, known for his grim demeanor and his reliance on traditional remedies, Eliza had become little more than a shadow of herself. The doctor, after a cursory examination, declared that it was some form of fever, but not one that could easily be explained. He prescribed a mixture of herbs and tinctures that he assured her mother would work their magic. But nothing worked. Eliza's condition worsened as the days passed. She became weak, unable to keep food down, and her once vibrant eyes were now dull, sunk deep into her face. Her skin took on an unnatural pallor, and the fever never once abated. It seemed as if life itself was slowly being drained from her. The local community rallied around the Wells family, as small towns often do in times of crisis. Friends and neighbors brought food, whispered prayers, and offered what little assistance they could. But their efforts were futile. The illness spread, creeping into the very bones of West Haven, leaving an air of dread hanging thick over the town. Soon, whispers began to circulate that something more sinister was at play. Some said it was a curse, others claimed it was a punishment from God. Eliza, they said, was marked, and they feared she would not survive. As the days dragged on, Eliza's mother, desperate and overwhelmed by the constant care her daughter needed, called upon the local healer, Miss Maria Clark. Miss Clark was known throughout the town for her knowledge of folk remedies, herbal potions, and ancient cures passed down through generations. She was a figure both revered and feared, a woman whose unorthodox methods often sparked suspicion but whose results could not be easily ignored. Miss Clark arrived at the Wells home just as the last light of day slipped behind the hills. She was an older woman, her face lined with age and experience, her hands steady despite the years. After examining Eliza for only a few moments, Miss Clark's face turned grave. She muttered something under her breath and began rummaging through her worn leather bag for a collection of herbs and powders. Her remedies were unconventional, dark, earthy concoctions that seemed to offer little in the way of comfort. But there was no time to question, no time to argue. For the next few days, Miss Clark worked tirelessly by Eliza's side, administering her potions and chanting softly as the girl slipped in and out of consciousness. The fever, however, refused to break. As Eliza's condition grew more precarious, the rumors in the town only grew louder. Some said that Miss Clark was not a healer at all but a witch, practicing dark arts on the helpless child. Others believed that Eliza's illness was punishment for something her family had done, some secret, some unspoken sin. The family's own faith was tested. Eliza's father, a quiet man who kept mostly to himself, turned to prayer, urging his wife to remain strong in their faith. They gathered around their daughter each night, their hands clasped in desperation, praying for a miracle. The fever remained. The illness deepened. And then, on the 6th day, Eliza stopped breathing. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The room was deathly silent, save for the soft rustling of the wind outside. Miss Clark stood motionless at Eliza's side, her face a mask of unreadable concern. The family, who had clung to hope until the very end, could not hold back their grief. It seemed as though the girl had simply slipped away, vanishing into the ether. But that's when something extraordinary happened. Eliza's mother, in a moment of sheer despair, collapsed beside her daughter's bed. She sobbed uncontrollably, her breath ragged and broken, as though her very soul was being torn from her chest. And then, just as the last of her tears had fallen, something shifted in the room. It was subtle at first, a faint tremor, like a breath of wind passing through the walls. Then, Eliza's chest rose. Just slightly, but enough for Miss Clark to notice. A gasp escaped her lips, and she quickly moved toward the bed. "What is it?" Eliza's mother asked, her voice trembling. "Look," Miss Clark whispered. Eliza's fingers twitched, and then, as if stirred by some unseen force, her eyes fluttered open. The fever had broken. The girl's color returned to her face, her once pale cheeks now flush with life. Her breathing became steady, her pulse strong. Eliza, against all odds, had come back. But it was not just the miracle of life that astonished everyone in the room. It was the suddenness of it, the way it defied all natural explanation. In the days that followed, the town was abuzz with Eliza's miraculous recovery. Doctors, healers, and even the religious leaders were baffled. How could a child, on the brink of death, suddenly rise from her bed as if nothing had happened? And yet, no one could explain it. The fever that had taken her so swiftly and violently was gone, and she seemed as healthy as she had ever been. There were no lingering symptoms, no after-effects. It was as if the illness had never been. But as much as the townspeople wanted to accept it as a miracle, there was an undercurrent of unease. Eliza had not simply survived, she had defied the natural order. And the whispers began again. They said she was touched by something beyond the understanding of man, something that could not be explained by science or faith alone. And as much as they tried to push those fears aside, they could not shake the unsettling feeling that something had been awoken in Eliza, something that neither the town nor its people could control. Eliza, for her part, never spoke of what she had experienced during those days. She couldn't. The fever, the darkness, the visions, they were fragments of a world beyond comprehension, things she could never truly explain. But deep down, she knew that her encounter with death had changed her forever. And in the quietest corners of her mind, she could not shake the feeling that the forces that had nearly claimed her life would one day return. West Haven was the kind of place that people rarely thought about unless they had to. Tucked away in the rugged hills of mid-19th century America, it wasn't a town of great importance. There were no grand estates or sprawling fields of gold. No bustling ports or famous landmarks that would attract outsiders. It was simply a quiet little town where life was ordinary, yet suffused with an undeniable sense of isolation. This was a place where time seemed to stand still, as though the world beyond the hills had long forgotten its existence. Yet, in the shadows of its seemingly peaceful streets, there were secrets, unspoken histories, old fears, and superstitions that ran deep within the soil of West Haven like a hidden river. It was a town of tight-knit families, each one holding its own unique piece of West Haven's patchwork past. There were the Millers, whose ancestors had settled there generations ago and whose name was synonymous with the small bakery at the corner of Main Street. There were the Grays, a family of farmers who'd worked the land for decades, growing their own crops and raising livestock. And then there were the Wells, a family of black descent, whose lineage was whispered about in hushed tones. Their presence in West Haven was tolerated, but only just. The Wells family had long been seen as outsiders, their ancestors arriving in the town under mysterious circumstances that no one cared to ask about. The townspeople simply accepted them as part of the landscape, as one accepts the quiet that falls over a town at dusk, something that is always there, though few ever acknowledge it. West Haven's residents lived with an unspoken understanding that the world beyond their town was a place of upheaval and change. The Civil War was just a few years in the past, and the country was still grappling with the aftermath of that turbulent period. But here, in West Haven, life moved at its own pace. News trickled in slowly, like water down a rocky stream, and by the time a message arrived, it was often watered down and distorted beyond recognition. The townsfolk preferred it that way, for the world beyond the hills held mysteries and dangers that they weren't eager to confront. They were comfortable in their isolation, convinced that the old ways, the ways of superstition and faith, were enough to protect them from whatever might lurk in the unknown. The town itself was small, a collection of weathered buildings clustered together along a single dirt road. The houses were simple, made of timber and brick, each one painted a dull shade of gray or brown, as though trying to blend into the landscape. The streets were narrow, often muddy, and only a few shops lined the main thoroughfare. There was the general store where people gathered for gossip and necessities, the apothecary where Miss Maria Clark worked her strange remedies, and a small church at the far end of the town square where the Reverend and his congregation would meet each Sunday. The town hall, where decisions were made and laws passed, was a modest building, almost hidden among the other structures. It wasn't a place that attracted attention, but it was a place where everything important took place. There was a peculiar quietness to West Haven, as though the people had become accustomed to living on the edge of their own world. The air, thick with the scent of damp earth and the distant fragrance of wildflowers, hung heavy with the unspoken knowledge that not everything was as it seemed. At first glance, everything appeared normal, almost idyllic, like a painting of rural life in its most serene form. But there were undercurrents in the town that suggested otherwise, a tension that simmered just below the surface, where the shadows stretched long into the evening and the wind carried the rustling whispers of things long forgotten. The social fabric of West Haven was tightly woven, yet there was an unspoken hierarchy that placed the Wells family near the bottom. Their status as a black family in a town that had largely been built by white settlers made them subjects of quiet suspicion. Their origins, like the origins of many who had settled there long ago, were a mystery. Some said the Wells family had arrived in West Haven after a fire had destroyed their previous home in a neighboring town. Others whispered that they had come from a far-off place, their family roots intertwined with the remnants of the Underground Railroad. But no one ever spoke of these things openly. The Wells were simply there, living on the outskirts of the town, their modest home nestled at the edge of the forest. Despite the prevailing silence surrounding their presence, the Wells family was not entirely unwelcome. They were a quiet family, hardworking and largely isolated, with a reputation for keeping to themselves. They did not partake in the gossip that circulated through the town streets, nor did they seek the approval of the townspeople. They simply lived their lives, just as any other family would. But there were moments when the town's residents couldn't ignore the strange aura that seemed to surround the Wells family, especially when it came to their youngest daughter, Eliza. Eliza Wells had always been different. Even as a child, she stood apart from the other children of West Haven. Where others played freely in the fields and forests, Eliza was often found alone, sitting at the edge of the creek or wandering the narrow paths through the woods that bordered the town. There was something about her that made people uneasy, even those who had known her since birth. It wasn't anything overt or obvious, she didn't have an air of malevolence, nor did she display any behavior that could be considered out of the ordinary. But there was a quiet intensity to her, a weight behind her eyes that made those who looked at her feel as though they were gazing into something far older and deeper than her years would suggest. Eliza's mother, Ruth, was a woman who had always kept her head down and her faith close. She had little interest in the town's gossip or in the prejudices that ran through the veins of Westhaven. Ruth worked tirelessly to raise her children, keeping her home clean and her family fed. She did not seek the approval of the townspeople, nor did she try to integrate her family into the social fabric of Westhaven. But there was no denying that her children, especially Eliza, seemed to stir something within the hearts of the town's residents. It was not long before the rumors about Eliza's family began to surface. People began to notice strange occurrences in and around the Wells household, inexplicable things that no one could quite explain. Some claimed that they had seen lights flickering at strange hours of the night, while others spoke of hearing whispers on the wind near the Wells property. Old folk legends about the land, the spirits that were said to inhabit the woods, and the rituals that had once been practiced in the area began to resurface. The more time went on, the more the people of Westhaven started to wonder if the Wells family was tied to something ancient, something that the town had long since forgotten, or perhaps, something that the town was too afraid to remember. But these were only whispers, faint and easily ignored. The residents of Westhaven had enough to worry about: the crops, the weather, and the ever-present challenges of rural life. There was little time to dwell on superstitions, especially when survival required every ounce of energy. Still, there was something about Eliza that nagged at the edges of their thoughts. And it would be only a matter of time before that unease would become something more. Something far darker. Westhaven may have been forgotten by the world beyond, but within its borders, it was a place steeped in history, a history of quiet struggles, hidden fears, and the kind of secrets that could change everything, if only someone were brave enough to confront them. It was a place where the past and present collided, where the unspoken and the unseen held power over the living, and where Eliza Wells' story would soon begin to unfold in ways that no one could ever have imagined. Eliza Wells had always carried a quiet weight with her, one that set her apart from the other children of Westhaven. To the outside world, she was like any other girl growing up in the small, isolated town, a child with a simple life, modest aspirations, and a family that kept mostly to itself. But beneath the surface, there was an enigmatic quality to her, a sort of darkness woven into her very being that even she could not fully comprehend. It was not something that she had ever openly acknowledged, nor was it something that her mother, Ruth, ever spoke of. But as Eliza grew older, it became impossible to ignore the strange pull of forces beyond her understanding, forces that began to reveal themselves more and more as she entered adolescence. From an early age, Eliza exhibited a sensitivity to the world around her that seemed far beyond her years. While other children ran through the fields, chasing butterflies and laughing in the sun, Eliza often withdrew into herself, seeking out the quiet corners of Westhaven's expansive woods. It was in these shadowy groves, among the tangled roots and the whispering leaves, that Eliza seemed most at ease. There was something about the silence of the forest that felt familiar to her, something in the air that spoke to her in ways words could not. She had never told anyone, but she often felt a presence there, a subtle, unseen force that seemed to watch over her, guiding her steps and listening to her thoughts. Despite the unusual nature of her affinity for the woods, Eliza never spoke of it. She never mentioned the strange sense of peace she felt when she was alone with the trees and the earth, nor did she share the eerie dreams that had plagued her since she was a young girl. Dreams of an ancient woman, dark and ageless, whispering words in a language that Eliza could never quite understand, but which seemed to echo in her very soul. These dreams, at first a fleeting curiosity, began to take on a more ominous tone as she grew older. The woman in her dreams seemed to be calling her, beckoning her towards something, something she could not yet name, but which filled her with both terror and wonder. Eliza's connection to the forest and the strange, unknowable forces within it was not something that was understood or accepted by the people of Westhaven. In a town like theirs, where superstition was often just as important as reason, strange occurrences were rarely viewed with kindness. The people of Westhaven preferred to keep their distance from anything that might upset the delicate balance of their small, tight-knit community. Anything out of the ordinary was viewed with suspicion, and Eliza, with her quiet, withdrawn nature, was often seen as a curiosity at best and a threat at worst. Her family, too, remained an enigma. The Wells family had long been a subject of quiet speculation in West Haven. They were different, a black family living in a town where few people of color were seen, and even fewer were embraced. No one knew much about the origins of the Wells family, and those who did rarely spoke of them. It was said that the Wells had come from a far-off place, perhaps the deep south or even beyond, and that their family history was marred by secrets too dark to reveal. The town's elders whispered that the Wells family had once been involved in the underground network that helped runaway slaves find freedom, and some even suggested that their ancestral ties were rooted in ancient spiritual practices, passed down through generations. Though the townspeople never spoke openly of these things, the weight of their suspicion hung in the air, thick and heavy. Eliza, in particular, bore the brunt of their unspoken judgment. It wasn't just her ethnicity that made her different, it was the aura of mystery that surrounded her, one that seemed to grow stronger with each passing year. The elders of the town, those who still clung to the old beliefs of their ancestors, began to notice the peculiarities of Eliza's presence, the way she seemed to move in and out of shadows with an ease that was unsettling, the way she could disappear into the woods for hours on end, only to return without a word. It was as though she was part of the landscape itself, her presence indistinguishable from the trees and the wind. But there was one thing about Eliza that seemed to truly set her apart, something far darker, far more dangerous than anything the townspeople had suspected. As the years went on, it became clear that Eliza was not like other children in more ways than one. The first sign of this difference came when Eliza was around 12 years old, the age when the children of West Haven began to form more solid identities, developing both the confidence and the misgivings that came with growing up. It was around this time that the first truly strange incident occurred, the kind of event that would forever alter the course of her life, and the life of West Haven itself. It started innocently enough, a game played by the children in the field behind the Wells family home. They were running and laughing, chasing each other through the tall grass under the watchful eye of the sun. Eliza was among them, though she seemed distracted, as though she were not fully present in the game. Her eyes were distant, focused on something that no one else could see. As the game progressed, the other children began to notice that Eliza seemed to be moving more quickly than the others, almost as if she were gliding across the field, her footsteps barely making a sound on the soft earth. Her movements were fluid, effortless, and unnaturally fast, so much so that the children began to fall behind, unable to keep up with her pace. It was then that something happened that no one could explain. As the children turned to chase her, they saw her disappear into the woods, not run, but simply vanish, as though she had been swallowed by the very earth itself. The other children stopped, stunned, unsure of what they had just witnessed. They called out her name, but there was no answer. The silence of the forest swallowed their voices, and the eerie stillness hung over the clearing like a heavy fog. When Eliza finally emerged from the woods, she appeared unchanged, but there was something about her eyes that was different, a depth to them, as though she had seen something no one else could comprehend. She spoke little of what had happened, brushing off the concerned questions of the other children with a half-hearted smile. But the event left an indelible mark on those who had witnessed it. They had seen her disappear without a trace, and they knew, deep down, that there was something otherworldly about Eliza. In the weeks that followed, strange things continued to happen in and around the Wells property. At night, the townspeople spoke of hearing strange sounds, the rustling of leaves when there was no wind, footsteps echoing through the woods when no one was there. Some claimed to have seen figures moving in the trees, though when they tried to approach, the figures would vanish without a trace. And always, in the background of these eerie occurrences, was Eliza. Though she never seemed to be directly involved in the strange events, her presence was undeniable. She was always there, on the edge of the woods, her eyes watching from the shadows. The townspeople's suspicions about Eliza deepened. Some began to say that she was not just different, but cursed. Others whispered that she was touched by something ancient, something that had long been forgotten by the world but had never truly gone away. No one could say for sure what it was, but it was clear that Eliza was at the center of it. The more the town watched her, the more they felt the pull of the unknown, the eerie sense that she was connected to something far larger and darker than they could ever understand. Eliza herself was unaware of the true extent of the mystery that surrounded her. She didn't know what the people whispered behind her back or what they thought of her. She only knew that there was something inside of her, something she could neither control nor fully comprehend, that seemed to call to the land, to the spirits that lingered just beyond the veil. It was a secret she had kept for as long as she could remember, but it was a secret that could not remain hidden for long. In the quiet depths of her heart, Eliza knew that the strange happenings in Westhaven were not just random occurrences. They were connected to her, to something within her that had been there since the moment she was born. And as much as she wanted to ignore it, to live a normal life like the other children, Eliza knew deep down that she was destined for something far greater, and far darker, than anything the town could ever imagine. As the years passed, Eliza Wells began to settle into the rhythm of life in Westhaven, even as her unusual nature continued to stir unease among the townspeople. While most of the town moved forward in its simple, predictable manner, Eliza remained a quiet enigma, a girl who seemed untouched by the everyday struggles that defined the lives of others. Her connection to the unseen, to the mysteries that lurked in the shadows of the woods and the whispers of forgotten folklore, was only deepening. But none of it could have prepared her or the people of Westhaven for what was about to unfold, the first brush with death that would haunt Eliza for the rest of her life. It began one unseasonably hot summer, when the air hung thick with humidity, and the sun beat down relentlessly on the town. The crops in the fields were beginning to wither under the oppressive heat, and the animals were restless, drinking from the wells dry in their thirst. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of something wrong that hung over Westhaven like a storm cloud, waiting to break. People spoke of the drought in hushed tones, of how the once vibrant fields were drying up, and how the river had receded to a mere trickle. Yet amidst all the talk of the land's suffering, one other shadow loomed over the town, the illness that seemed to have come out of nowhere, and which no one could explain. It wasn't long before the first case appeared. At first, it was just one person, then another, then a few more. The illness spread through the town like wildfire, catching hold of those who seemed the least vulnerable, attacking even the strongest members of the community with a swift, brutal force. It was unlike anything anyone had seen before. The fever struck hard, high and fast, leaving its victims bedridden and delirious. Their skin turned pale, almost translucent, as though the very life was being drained from their bodies. And, just as quickly as it came, the disease seemed to vanish, but not before leaving behind a trail of suffering, and in some cases, death. The disease, like a dark specter, swept through Westhaven without warning or mercy. No one was immune, and the local doctors were at a loss. Their methods, bloodletting, herbal tinctures, and poultices, seemed utterly ineffective. The people of Westhaven, already superstitious by nature, began to speak in fearful whispers of curses, of old sins catching up to the town. Some turned to religion, praying in fervent, desperate hopes of salvation. Others consulted Miss Maria Clark, the local healer, who had long been viewed with suspicion by the townsfolk, her methods far removed from conventional medicine. But nothing could stop the fever, and as the death toll rose, so too did the anxiety that gripped the town. Eliza's family was not immune to the disease. It struck Ruth, Eliza's mother, first. She was a woman of unwavering faith, practical and stoic, but she fell ill with the same fever that was sweeping through the town. Within days, she was bedridden, her body racked with fever and chills. The sickness, so sudden and unforgiving, seemed to steal the very strength from her. Her once strong hands trembled as she clutched the sheets, her eyes dull and unfocused, and for the first time in her life, she looked frail. The Wells family home, which had always been a place of relative peace, was now a place of dread, as Eliza's father, Isaac, tried in vain to nurse his wife back to health. As Ruth's condition worsened, Eliza, who had long been attuned to the subtle energies of the world around her, felt a strange shift in the air. It was as though the illness was not just a physical affliction, but something more, something malevolent, like a dark cloud that had descended over their home, suffocating everything in its path. Eliza spent her days sitting by her mother's bedside, her eyes fixed on her mother's fevered form, her thoughts drifting. She felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness, something she was not accustomed to. There was a time when she would have known what to do, a time when the woods whispered secrets to her, when the old spirits guided her. But now, she was lost. She could not understand why her mother, so strong, was being ravaged by this invisible enemy. It was on the 4th day of Ruth's illness that Eliza began to feel something truly terrible stirring within her. It was as though a shadow, cold and ancient, was creeping ever closer. She could feel it in her bones, in the way the air had grown thick with an oppressive energy. And then, at night, just as she was about to fall asleep beside her mother's bed, Eliza heard a voice, soft, almost a whisper, yet unmistakably clear. The voice was calling her name, pulling her from the depths of sleep. Eliza, at first, she thought it was her mother speaking, but when she looked down at Ruth's bed, she saw that her mother was still in a feverish slumber, her breathing shallow and labored. The voice came again, closer now, as though it were beside her, but when Eliza turned, there was nothing there. No one. Nothing but the shadows creeping along the walls of the room. It was in that moment that Eliza knew something was terribly wrong. The next morning, when Eliza woke, she found her mother's fever had spiked even higher. Ruth's breathing was labored, and her skin was clammy to the touch. It was then that Eliza realized something else: the sickness had taken root in their home, and it was consuming them both. It was no ordinary illness, it was something more sinister, something Eliza could not yet fully understand. In a panic, Eliza ran to the well to fetch water, desperate for something, anything, to help her mother. But as she reached the well, she saw a shadow moving in the trees at the edge of the property. It was a figure, barely discernible in the dim light of morning, watching her with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. Eliza's heart raced as she turned and rushed back inside, feeling the weight of the unseen presence pressing down on her. By the time she returned to the house, her mother's condition had taken a turn for the worse. Ruth was barely conscious now, her breath ragged and shallow, her face pale and drenched in sweat. Her pulse was weak, and Eliza could feel the life draining from her. It was clear that nothing could save Ruth now. But as Eliza knelt beside her mother, trying to offer comfort in her final moments, something remarkable happened. Ruth's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, she seemed to recognize her daughter. She whispered, her voice hoarse and trembling, "Eliza, you are the one." Those were the last words Ruth ever spoke. With a final shudder, she passed away, leaving Eliza alone with her grief and a question that had no answer. For days after her mother's death, Eliza wandered the woods, her mind reeling with the enormity of what had transpired. What was the sickness that had taken her mother's life? Why had Ruth been marked by it, as though it had sought her out? And why had Eliza felt that shadow, that ancient presence, closing in? She had no answers, only more questions. But as she walked through the trees, feeling the weight of the grief that hung heavy in her chest, Eliza knew one thing for certain: the world she once understood was no longer the same. She had seen the darkness that lay beyond, and it was watching her. And as the days turned into weeks, Westhaven's inexplicable sickness, the one that had claimed her mother's life, seemed to have disappeared as quickly as it had come. But the memories remained. And with them, a gnawing sense that what had happened in their home was only the beginning. As the funeral rites for Ruth Wells passed in a muted blur, the town of Westhaven was consumed by an uneasy calm. On the surface, life resumed its usual pace, with the daily rhythms of farming, trade, and gossip continuing as they always had. Yet, beneath the veneer of routine, there was a palpable tension, a strange shift that even the most hardened residents couldn't ignore. Ruth's death, though a tragedy in itself, seemed to have unleashed something far darker, something more unnerving than anyone had anticipated. And Eliza, her grief still raw, felt it too, the heavy presence that clung to her, following her every step, even as she wandered the streets of the town. But it was not only Eliza who sensed the change. The townspeople, though quick to dismiss the growing rumors of something sinister, could not shake the feeling that something had been disturbed. From the moment Ruth passed, the whispers began. At first, it was only a faint murmur, carried by the wind that rustled the trees at the edge of town. But over time, the whispers grew louder, carried from one home to the next, from one shopkeeper to another. Some spoke of Eliza herself, of how she had always been different, how the strange occurrences surrounding her family were no coincidence. It was not long before the oldest rumors began to resurface, rumors that Eliza's family had ties to powers far beyond the understanding of the people of Westhaven. Dark powers. Ancient forces. And with Ruth's death, many in the town began to fear that Eliza had inherited those same forces, that she was now a vessel for something malevolent. The residents of Westhaven, always a superstitious group, turned their eyes toward Eliza with growing suspicion. The Wells family had never been fully accepted, their black ancestry, their peculiar ways, and the inexplicable events that seemed to follow them were things the town had always kept at arm's length. But now, in the wake of Ruth's untimely death, it was as though a veil had been lifted, revealing the shadows that had always lingered at the edges of the town. Eliza's every move, every glance, was scrutinized, and the rumors took on a life of their own. Miss Maria Clark, the town's healer, was among the few who saw the deeper truth. Though she had always been viewed with suspicion by the more devout members of the community, Miss Clark was not one to succumb to fear or superstition. She had long been attuned to the subtle energies of the world, the unseen forces that swirled around the town like a quiet storm, just waiting to be acknowledged. But when Ruth Wells died, Miss Clark felt something in the air change. It was as though the natural order had been upended, and something far darker had taken its place. In the days after the funeral, Miss Clark visited the Wells home, concerned for Eliza. She found the girl in the woods, sitting in the same spot she often retreated to in moments of distress. Eliza's eyes, once full of quiet mystery, now seemed hollow, as though she had seen something that had stolen her innocence. Miss Clark could sense the heavy burden Eliza carried, but she was also keenly aware of the unnatural energy that had coiled itself around the girl. "Child," Miss Clark said gently, kneeling beside Eliza, "I know you are grieving. But you must listen. There is something you need to understand about what has happened. You are not alone in this. There are forces at work here, forces that cannot be ignored." Eliza looked up at her, her face a mask of both confusion and resignation. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her voice trembling with both fear and curiosity. "You must trust me, Eliza," Miss Clark continued, her voice steady, though her eyes betrayed the depth of her concern. "This town, the sickness that came and went so quickly, the way your mother passed so suddenly. It is no accident. There is a darkness here, and it is connected to you. It always has been." Eliza recoiled, feeling the weight of the healer's words settle on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. "I don't understand," she whispered again, more to herself than to Miss Clark. "What darkness? What are you talking about?" The older woman's eyes softened as she reached out, placing a hand on Eliza's. "The land, Eliza, the very earth under our feet, it is tied to things that are old, older than any of us. There are forces, ancient ones, that live in the shadows, and they have watched over this town for generations. They do not forget." Eliza, her mind still foggy from grief, looked away, her gaze drifting back to the distant trees that seemed to whisper in the breeze. "I don't know what you're saying, but I feel it. It's like something is calling to me. Something dark." Miss Clark sighed deeply. "It is not just calling to you, Eliza. It has always been a part of you. Your blood, your lineage, it is tied to the land, to the old ways. And now, with your mother gone, you must understand that you are the one who is being tested. The darkness is coming, whether you are ready or not." The words hung in the air between them like a thunderclap, each syllable laden with an unspoken threat. Eliza felt a chill run down her spine. She had always known there was something different about her, something far beyond her control. But hearing Miss Clark's words, so certain and heavy with the weight of experience, filled her with a deep sense of foreboding. I don't know what to do," Eliza confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "You do not have to do this alone," Miss Clark replied softly. "But you must understand that you cannot escape it. The forces are too strong, too ancient. You must face them, or they will consume you." In the days that followed, the town continued its denial. The elders and religious leaders dismissed Miss Clark's warnings as the ramblings of a superstitious old woman. The more progressive citizens of West Haven refused to entertain the idea that something supernatural was afoot. They chose to believe the illness that had claimed Ruth was simply a mysterious, but natural, affliction, and that Eliza's connection to her family's mysterious past was nothing more than a series of coincidences. After all, the idea that something dark could be lurking beneath the surface of their quiet town was too unsettling, too impossible to accept. And yet, as much as the townspeople tried to put the thoughts out of their minds, they could not shake the unease that gripped them. It was as though an invisible weight had descended upon West Haven, a shadow that clung to every street, every home. Eliza, for her part, remained silent. She could feel the growing chasm between her and the rest of the town, the shift in how they viewed her. She was no longer just the quiet girl with strange tendencies, now, she was something else, something feared, something unknown. The whispers about her grew louder, and she heard them every time she walked through the streets, hushed voices in the market, behind closed doors, and in the corners of the local tavern. She tried to ignore it, to live her life in the shadow of her mother's death, but the weight of the town's judgment was unbearable. It wasn't long before the signs began to show themselves again, the subtle tremors in the ground, the strange happenings in the woods, the inexplicable shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. And with each passing day, Eliza could feel the darkness drawing closer. She knew that Miss Clark's words were not mere superstition, that the forces at work in West Haven were not something to be dismissed. They were real. And the time was coming when Eliza would have to confront them, whether she was ready or not. The town's denial could not protect them for much longer. The ancient forces were stirring, and soon, West Haven would be forced to face the truth, that some darkness, once awakened, could never be extinguished. The days in West Haven seemed to stretch endlessly, a cycle of oppressive heat and growing dread. It wasn't just the unrelenting summer sun or the drought that threatened the crops. The very air felt thick, as if it carried a weight that pressed down on everything, the trees, the people, the land itself. There was an unsettled quality that gripped the town, a tension in the very fabric of life that no one could quite explain. But for Eliza, it wasn't just the town that seemed to be unraveling. Her own mind and body felt like they were being pulled apart by forces she could no longer control or even understand. The whispers, once faint and distant, had become impossible to ignore. The townspeople no longer looked at her with pity or indifference. Instead, they regarded her with a mix of fear and distrust. Their once quiet suspicions had blossomed into open hostility. It was subtle at first, averted gazes, hushed conversations when she walked by, the way people stepped aside as if to avoid coming into contact with her. But it wasn't long before it became more overt. There were stares, not of curiosity, but of open judgment. Parents warned their children to stay away from her, and the churchgoers, who had once nodded politely at her in passing, now turned their heads with barely concealed disdain. It was as though Eliza was no longer just a girl, she had become a symbol of something unholy, something to be feared. Eliza, for her part, could feel the weight of the town's rejection as though it were a physical presence. It was suffocating, the cold stares of her neighbors pressing against her like a wall. She had never fit in with the people of West Haven, but this new hostility, this palpable fear, was different. It gnawed at her, especially in the quiet hours when she was alone. At night, when the world was still, she could feel the dark energy in the air, creeping into her thoughts, filling her with a sense of unease that she could not shake. Her connection to the mysterious forces that had always seemed to lurk just beyond her understanding had deepened in ways she couldn't explain. It was as though something inside her was waking up, something dark and powerful that she couldn't control. The strange dreams, the eerie whispers, the feeling of being watched, they had all become more intense. And worst of all, she had started to feel that she wasn't entirely herself anymore. There were moments, fleeting but unmistakable, when she felt as if she were slipping away from her own body, as if she were no longer in control of her own thoughts or actions. It was as if something else was moving through her, taking over when she wasn't looking. One evening, after yet another day of cruel whispers and cold shoulders, Eliza found herself wandering into the woods once more. The trees seemed to call to her, their branches swaying gently in the evening breeze as if beckoning her deeper into their dark embrace. Eliza didn't know why she went, perhaps because the woods had always been a place of solitude and peace, a place where she could escape the eyes of the town. But tonight was different. Tonight, the woods felt more alive than they ever had before. There was an energy in the air, a crackling intensity that filled the space between the trees, as if the very earth itself was waiting for something to happen. She walked for what felt like hours, her feet moving automatically, her mind numb with the weight of her own thoughts. The deeper she went, the darker it became, the shadows growing longer and more twisted, until it was hard to distinguish where the trees ended and the darkness began. And then, without warning, Eliza stopped. There, just ahead of her, was a figure standing in the clearing. At first, she thought it might be one of the town's residents, though she couldn't imagine who would be out here at this hour. But as she drew closer, she realized the figure was not human at all. It was a woman, or something that resembled a woman. She was tall, impossibly tall, with long, flowing hair that seemed to shimmer in the pale light of the moon. Her skin was as pale as bone, and her eyes, Eliza could see them even from a distance, were dark, empty voids that seemed to pull at the very fabric of reality. There was no warmth in her gaze, no hint of kindness or compassion. She was cold, distant, ancient. Eliza froze, her heart pounding in her chest. This was not someone she recognized, not anyone from Westhaven. She wanted to speak, to ask who this woman was, but her throat was dry, her voice caught in her chest. The woman tilted her head, a small, eerie smile playing at the corners of her lips. And then she spoke. "Eliza," the woman said, her voice soft but carrying an unsettling power. "I have been waiting for you." Eliza's blood ran cold. She had heard the voice before, in her dreams, in the whispers that had haunted her in the dead of night. The woman's voice was the same one that had called to her from the shadows, the one that had always seemed to be just on the edge of her perception. "What do you want from me?" Eliza managed to whisper, her voice trembling. The woman smiled again, the expression both beautiful and terrifying. "I want nothing from you, child. I am here to help you remember. To help you understand what you truly are." Eliza took a step back, her heart racing. "What do you mean? I don't understand. Who are you?" The woman's smile faded, and she took a step closer, her movements fluid and unnaturally graceful. "You do not know yet, but you will. You are tied to the old ways, Eliza. Your blood, your family, your very existence, it all has a purpose. You are not like the others. You were never meant to be. You are the vessel for something ancient, something powerful." Eliza's mind spun. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't real. I don't want this. I don't want any of this." The woman stepped forward, her presence overwhelming, like a weight pressing down on Eliza's chest. "It does not matter what you want. It is not your choice. You are bound to this fate, whether you accept it or not. The darkness is already inside of you, Eliza. You have always known it." Eliza staggered back, feeling her breath catch in her throat. She wanted to run, to escape this woman and the terrifying knowledge she was speaking of, but her legs wouldn't move. The shadows around her seemed to grow thicker, pressing in from all sides. The forest felt alive, pulsating with a dark energy, and Eliza could feel the pull of it, tugging at her very soul. And then, just as quickly as the woman had appeared, she was gone, vanishing into the night like a wisp of smoke. Eliza was left standing in the clearing, her heart hammering in her chest, her body trembling with fear. She didn't know what had just happened, whether it had been real or some hallucination brought on by the stress and grief that had consumed her. But one thing was certain, she could feel it now, more clearly than ever before. The darkness, the thing that had been lurking just beneath the surface of her life, was real. And it was coming for her. In the days that followed, Eliza's sense of isolation deepened. The townspeople grew more distant, their suspicion of her turning into outright fear. She could feel their eyes on her wherever she went, like shadows that trailed behind her, never letting her go. But it wasn't just the townspeople that haunted her. It was the darkness itself, the ancient force that had spoken to her in the woods, the force that had claimed her family, her bloodline, and now, her very existence. It was a presence that clung to her like a shadow, one she could not escape, no matter how hard she tried. She began to feel it even in her sleep, as though the woman's words were echoing in her mind, over and over again, until they became all she could think about. The truth was inescapable. She was bound to the darkness, and the more she resisted it, the more it consumed her. Eliza didn't know how to stop it, how to break free from the forces that were closing in around her. But one thing was certain, the madness had begun, and it would not end until she faced what lay within her, the ancient power, the curse, the truth that had always been there, hidden beneath the surface of her life. As Eliza's understanding of the strange forces at work around her deepened, so too did her sense of alienation. The encounter in the woods with the dark figure had opened a door, one that she could not close, no matter how desperately she tried. The chilling words of the woman, that haunting declaration that Eliza was bound to something ancient and powerful, echoed in her mind relentlessly. The shadows in her dreams grew longer, and the whispers she had always felt on the periphery of her awareness began to intensify, until they seemed to pulse with a life of their own. She could feel them closing in, encroaching upon her every waking moment. But as the days wore on, Eliza found herself retreating further into herself. The town's increasing hostility, fueled by its superstitions and fear of the unknown, only added to her growing sense of isolation. It was not just the whispers in the streets or the pointed looks from the townspeople. It was the sense that they no longer saw her as human, not in the way they saw each other, not in the way they had once viewed her. She was no longer a girl from Westhaven, she was something else, something that did not belong in their world. The coldness of their gaze, the avoidance, the subtle cruelty in their whispers, all of it served to deepen the rift between her and the town that had once been her home. But Eliza could not escape what was happening to her. It was as if the very earth beneath her feet had begun to shift, as though she were caught in a current, being pulled toward a place she didn't understand but could no longer resist. The strange woman's words, "You are the vessel," lingered with her constantly. What did it mean to be a vessel? What power was she meant to carry? The woman in the woods had claimed she was bound to something ancient, something from a time long before Westhaven existed. Eliza didn't know what that something was, but it had left a mark on her. Her blood was not just her own, it was part of a long lineage tied to forces older than the town, forces that were stirring within her, demanding to be awakened. The restless nights grew more frequent, and her dreams became darker, more vivid. In these dreams, she no longer saw the familiar face of her mother or the comforting landscape of Westhaven. Instead, she found herself standing in a vast, desolate wasteland, the air thick with smoke and the smell of decay. The ground beneath her feet was cracked and dry, and the sky was an unnatural shade of red, as though the very heavens were on fire. And always, in the distance, she could hear the same voice calling to her, the voice of the woman she had met in the woods. "Eliza, come to me," it was a voice that filled her with both terror and longing. A voice that promised knowledge, power, and perhaps even release from the suffocating grip of her grief. It was a voice that spoke to the very core of her being, to something deep within her that had lain dormant for so long. But with each passing night, the dreams became more than just dreams. The line between waking and sleeping blurred. Eliza began to lose track of time, of reality. The shadows that had once danced around the edges of her perception now seemed to take form. They whispered to her when no one was around, their voices low and unintelligible, but laced with an unmistakable urgency. Come closer." At first, Eliza resisted. She had learned to ignore the unsettling whispers, to dismiss them as figments of her imagination. But as they grew louder, more insistent, she found herself drawn to them. It wasn't a choice, it was a compulsion, a pull she couldn't explain. She felt as though she were being guided, led by forces far beyond her understanding, forces that had been waiting for her to finally acknowledge them. And so, one night, unable to withstand the pressure any longer, Eliza followed the whispers into the woods. The moon was full, casting an eerie silver light over the land. The trees seemed to reach out toward her, their branches twisting like gnarled fingers. Eliza felt the weight of the air around her, thick and oppressive, as though the very forest were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The path before her was unclear, the shadows casting strange shapes that danced in the corner of her vision. But the whispers were clearer now, stronger, and she followed them, step by step, deeper into the heart of the woods. The further she went, the more the world seemed to change. The trees grew taller, their trunks wider, their bark dark and twisted. The ground beneath her feet felt soft, almost spongy, as though the earth itself were alive, breathing beneath her. And then, in the center of a clearing, she saw it. The woman, the one who had spoken to her in the dreams, the one who had appeared in the woods that fateful night. She was standing in the clearing, her figure bathed in an ethereal light that made her seem both otherworldly and terrifying. "Eliza," the woman's voice echoed through the trees, a sound that seemed to vibrate in Eliza's very bones. "You have come." "I don't know what you want from me," Eliza whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't understand." The woman smiled, and there was something both gentle and sorrowful in her expression. "You do not need to understand yet, child. All in good time. But know this, you have always been destined for this. Your bloodline is ancient. Your ancestors walked these lands long before West Haven was even a thought in the minds of those who founded it. You are tied to the land in ways you cannot begin to fathom. And now, the time has come for you to fulfill your purpose." Eliza's heart pounded in her chest, her hands trembling at her sides. "Purpose," she repeated, as if the word itself could bring her some understanding. "What purpose?" The woman's eyes seemed to pierce through her, and for the first time, Eliza felt as if she were seeing something beyond the surface of the woman's cold exterior. She felt as if she were gazing into the depths of an abyss, dark, vast, and infinite. "Your purpose is to awaken the power within you, Eliza. The power of the old ways. The power that has been lying dormant for generations, waiting for you. It is a force that runs through your veins, a force that will either make you strong or break you. And you, my dear, must choose. Will you embrace it, or will you let it consume you?" Eliza's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to run, to escape the overwhelming presence of the woman, but she was frozen in place, caught in the gravity of the moment. The woman's words filled her with a sense of foreboding that she couldn't shake, and yet, there was something else, something compelling, something that drew her in. It was as though the darkness, the very thing she had feared and resisted for so long, was offering her something she could not refuse. "You cannot escape it," the woman continued, her voice soft, yet filled with undeniable power. "It is within you. It always has been. And now, Eliza, it is time for you to decide." The clearing around Eliza seemed to darken, the shadows growing deeper, the air thicker. She could feel the weight of her destiny pressing down on her, suffocating her. The woman's words resonated in her mind, reverberating with a strange finality. This was it, the choice she had feared was finally here. Embrace the darkness. Let it consume her. Or resist it, and risk losing herself forever. Eliza stood at the precipice, caught between two worlds, the one she had known, the one that had once been familiar and safe, and the one that was opening up before her, dark and unknowable. And as she looked into the woman's eyes, she knew that her decision would determine everything. It would decide the course of her life, and the fate of West Haven itself. But for now, there was only silence. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her next move. The days that followed Eliza's encounter with the woman in the woods were nothing short of a blur. Her once familiar world, the small, close-knit town of West Haven, had begun to feel increasingly foreign, as though she were moving through it in a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. The boundaries between what was real and what was not began to erode, and the once clear lines separating the waking world from the realm of shadows now seemed indistinct, as if she were walking the edge of two realities. Each day, Eliza found herself slipping deeper into confusion. The whispers, once soft and fleeting, had now become a constant presence in her life. It was as though the very fabric of reality was thinning, unraveling at the seams, and Eliza was trapped in the middle, caught between two worlds that were steadily encroaching upon one another. The town, which had once felt like a place she belonged to, now felt like a cage. The people who had known her for years now looked at her with a mixture of fear, curiosity, and suspicion, as though she were no longer the same person they had once known. Her interactions with the townsfolk became increasingly strained. She could feel their eyes on her whenever she walked through the streets, their whispers, barely audible but always present, followed her like a shadow. It was as if the very air around her had become charged with an energy she couldn't quite grasp, but which she knew was dark and dangerous. The people of West Haven were no longer just avoiding her, they were actively avoiding anything that might remind them of the dark forces that had seemed to awaken with her mother's death. The unspoken rule was clear: Eliza was something to be feared, something unnatural. Her nights, too, had become an endless source of torment. The once peaceful slumber she had known as a child was now plagued by dreams that were increasingly vivid and terrifying. Each night, she found herself standing in that same desolate wasteland, the one filled with fire and smoke, the sky burning with an unnatural light. The woman, always standing just out of reach, would call to her, her voice both soothing and insistent, urging her to come closer, to understand, to embrace what was waiting for her. Eliza, the woman's voice would echo through the dreamscape. Come to me. You know you are mine. Every time Eliza reached out, every time she thought she might touch the woman or understand what was happening, the dream would fracture, as though it were breaking apart before her very eyes. The landscape would crack, splintering into pieces like glass, and Eliza would wake with a start, her heart racing, her breath shallow and panicked. The haunting images of the dream would cling to her, lingering long after she had opened her eyes, making it impossible to shake the feeling that she was on the cusp of something she was not ready to face. It was during one of these waking moments, in the aftermath of yet another nightmare, that Eliza found herself on the edge of something far worse than fear. It was as if the very walls of her mind were crumbling, as though her sanity, which had once seemed so solid and unshakable, was beginning to slip away, little by little. She had been struggling for days to hold on to a sense of normalcy, to make sense of the growing storm inside her, but now, it seemed like the storm was finally breaking through. It was no longer a whisper in the back of her mind. It was a roar, drowning out everything else. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows stretched long across the land, Eliza made her way out into the woods again, drawn by an inexplicable pull she could no longer ignore. The woman's voice still rang in her ears, echoing through her mind. Her dreams, her waking thoughts, everything was leading her back to this place, to this moment. She could feel it now, the full weight of it. The power that was waiting for her. The power that would change everything. As Eliza stepped into the forest, the air felt thick and oppressive, as though the very trees themselves were watching her, waiting for her to make the next move. She could hear the wind rustling the leaves above her, but it was a hollow, empty sound, like the world itself was holding its breath. She walked deeper into the woods, her mind spinning, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and desire. There was no turning back now. The pull was too strong, the darkness too near. Finally, she reached the clearing where she had seen the woman before. But this time, it was different. The air was heavier, the shadows darker, as though the world itself had shifted in some subtle, invisible way. The moon, pale and distant, cast an eerie glow over the landscape, but it was not enough to dispel the darkness that had descended upon the woods. The clearing was empty, but Eliza could feel the presence of something far older, far more powerful, than she could comprehend. Eliza, the woman's voice came from the shadows, her tone soft and familiar, yet carrying an unmistakable weight. You have come. At last. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. She didn't want to believe it. She didn't want to acknowledge the terrible truth that was standing before her, but she couldn't escape it. The woman was real. The power was real. And it was waiting for her. I've come, Eliza said, her voice barely a whisper. But I don't understand. What am I supposed to do? The woman's eyes gleamed in the darkness, and for the first time, Eliza saw something in them, something not just cold, but ancient and wise. You know what to do. It is your destiny, Eliza. Your blood calls to it. The land calls to you. All that has been will be again. You are the key, the vessel, and now you must unlock what has been hidden. Eliza's mind reeled. She had heard these words before, had felt them pressing on her every thought, but now they felt different. More real. More urgent. Her thoughts were spiraling, and for the first time, Eliza felt like she was losing control. The woman was right, there was something within her, something that had always been there, hidden beneath the surface, waiting to break free. But what was it? And why now? Why had it chosen her? Her pulse quickened as the woman stepped closer, her shadow swallowing the light around her. Embrace what you are, Eliza, she said, her voice low and hypnotic. It is time for you to become who you were always meant to be. Eliza felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She wanted to scream, to run, to fight against this force that seemed to be drawing her in like a black hole. But her body betrayed her, remaining rooted to the spot as if the earth itself were holding her in place. Suddenly, the woman raised her hand, and a surge of energy, raw, uncontained, and powerful, filled the air. The ground beneath Eliza's feet trembled, and the trees groaned as if they were alive. Eliza could feel it in her bones, the power surging through her, awakening something deep within her that had been dormant for far too long. It was as if the very fabric of the world was bending around her, reshaping itself to fit some ancient design she could not understand. And in that moment, Eliza realized the terrible truth, the breaking point had arrived. She could no longer hold back the forces within her. She could no longer pretend to be the girl she once was. The darkness, the power, it was all part of her now. And there was no escaping it. With a final, shuddering breath, Eliza let go of her fear. She embraced the power, the darkness, the ancient force that had been waiting for her all along. It consumed her, filling her mind, her body, her soul with a terrifying clarity. She understood now, there was no going back. She was part of something far greater, far older, than she could ever have imagined. And in that moment, Eliza's transformation was complete.